back to part 3 of our week 2 photo history lecture. In the last video we started talking about the work of an art critic and criticizing photographs and works of art. We started talking about the need to accurately describe the photograph so that we can use the information we gather there to make a plausible interpretation of the image. We talked about some ways we can tell whether an interpretation is a valid one. We're going to start this one off talking about context. This is part of the information you're going to gather in your description of a photo, and there's a few different kinds of context that we need to consider. I wanted to start off showing you some images. We're going to keep these in mind. We'll come back to them again. I wanted to show you these first, so you keep them in mind. We're going to use them as kind of test cases. So we'll start off with a few by the photographer Harry Callahan of his wife Eleanor. He shot her a lot over the years. His style sometimes is very abstract, sometimes it's straightforward. He shot many different kinds of subject matter, but his wife was a subject he returned to often. And you can see just from that brief selection there, he photographed her in many different ways. Those are some that we'll start with. Just keep those in mind. It'll be helpful for us to apply this to all of this information to these photos. So depending on what context we view the work in, our interpretation might change. So if we're going to arrive at a trustworthy interpretation, we need to have some prior and accurate knowledge of the photograph, which includes who made it, when it was made, where it was made, how it was made, and why it was made. What did they hope to accomplish with the photograph? So those are a few things. Seem pretty obvious. We should probably know who made it. That might make a big difference. When it was made, that can give us some really important information. If it coincides with something historic, then we need to know, did it happen before or during or after a really important event? Where it was made, even with how it was made, the process, that can tell us important things too. And if we have access to why it was made, that can be also incredibly helpful. But first we need to consider, there's basically 3 kinds of context that we'll consider. The first being internal context. Internal context, these are the kinds of things that you will see in the photo. So when we're at that very beginning of just trying to describe the photo either to ourselves or maybe someone else, the very obvious thing, what is the subject matter? What kind of object, person, thing, what is in front of us in the photograph? The medium, is it a digital photograph? If it is, was it shot with a cell phone? Was it shot with a point and shoot camera, a DSLR? Was it shot with 35mm film? Or a large format film? Was it color? Was it wet plate collodion? Was it a daguerreotype? Was it a calotype? Those things can give us a lot of important information to help understand the photograph. We're going to consider the form, the composition, how it's framed, where information is placed in the frame of the photograph. So these are all things that you can see. That's why they're referred to as internal context. They're things that you'll see inside the photo. And then we're going to, look at how are they related to each other. Does the form in some way help make the subject matter more apparent? Does the photographer use all of the various, features of the camera, the aperture and depth of field and shutter speed and motion and framing? Do they use all of these things together to guide your eye so that we know what the subject matter is? Next, there's original context. So original context is going to tell us who made it. So we need some biographical information. What did the artist intend with the photo? With more contemporary things, this is a lot easier to find. With older works, it gets harder and harder to find what the artist's intent is. And the further back you go, it gets hard to find even who made it. So we don't know who made it. We don't know what they intended. But the more recent it is, it tends to be easier to find these things, and they can be really, really helpful. We need to know something about the culture and the times that they're living in. It's not very hard to understand that a photograph made today in America has a lot of things going on culturally and socially that are very different than say, a photograph made in Japan in 1900. And if you're an outsider to the culture of the photograph you're looking at, there might be things that would be obvious to someone from that culture. So let's say a Japanese person at the turn of the century looking at that photograph, there's things that they would understand immediately, and there might be things that we living in America in 2020 might miss. So understanding something of the culture where the photograph was produced is going to help. We might also need to consider other work by the photographer. So is this photograph kind of an outlier, or does this photograph stand out as being very different from other work by the photographer? Or does this work share some continuity with other projects or other bodies of work by this photographer? So we need to look at what else they've done. And then we might also compare it to other photographers, other artists, other musicians, other mediums, to try to understand where does it fit? Does it fit? If it does, what are the links that we can find? Again, this kind of goes with culture, but we need to understand some of the history and politics and religion, and just the intellectual climate of the period. Lastly, external context. This is a situation or the place in which a photograph is presented or found. So are you seeing this photograph on your phone? Are you seeing it in a newspaper? Are you seeing it in a gallery or on a billboard, on your TV? And we're not seeing too many things in movie theaters these days, but you get the idea. This is the place where you're going to encounter the photograph. Where you see the photograph is going to make a big difference. So let's consider a couple of photographs. This one is by William Seaman. He was the 1959 Pulitzer Prize winner for this photograph. Right away we can tell several things about the photograph. So let's consider the internal context. What's in the photograph? There's what appears to be a body draped and covered. From the size of it, it looks like it's probably a kid. You see the wagon that's smashed. I think it's pretty safe to say the wagon goes with the body. There's what looks to be a police officer. There's other kids standing and looking. We don't know if they know the kid or not. And there's the man on the left wearing white, carrying a case, walking away, who appears to be probably a doctor or a nurse. When we look at the cars and the way they're dressed, it seems probable that this happened in America and this was in the 1950s. So even if we didn't see the caption, we didn't know, and we just encountered the photograph all by itself, there's a lot of things we could gather about it. When we look at the original context, then we start digging and say, okay, William Seaman, we could go look and see how much biographical information is available about him. We need to understand something of 1950s America. We think of compared to today, especially today, these last few months, where people are spending much more time indoors compared to 1959. In the 1950s, it wouldn't have been very uncommon for kids to be roaming around their neighborhoods or even quite a distance from their neighborhood unsupervised and potentially getting into trouble or accidents like this. Whereas today, usually kids are kind of kept on a tighter leash, and especially right now with the coronavirus, they might not be getting outside a whole lot at all. So they're kind of simple, small things, but you can see that there's the context in which the photograph was made is important. This photograph by Nick Ut was made during the Vietnam War. And in this scene, there had just been a napalm bomb had been dropped in the background there. And this family was hit. And in particular, the girl who's not wearing any clothes, all of her clothes were burned off. And she suffered extensive burns all over her body. She lives, I believe, in Canada now. You can read about her story now. It's pretty incredible. But this photograph, there's lots culturally and biographically, the photographer is still alive. There's lots we could find out about him and the era when this was made. But another context, let's use this one to consider external context. If I read this in the newspaper, then I'm thinking it's either about, if I lived in the 60s, I'm thinking this is current events. If I read about it now, I'm thinking this is a story about the people in it, but what's happened to them since, something more current. But if I see this in a gallery, then I might unconsciously look at this photo more for its aesthetic and formal qualities, and not so much what it was trying to say at the time, the events it was trying to capture and share with people. If I saw this on a billboard with text on it, it might be telling me something about the dangers of war. It might be an anti-war advertisement. So depending on where we see this, it could take on different shades of meaning to it. You can see how it can, with memes today, they start off with an image that could have been made under completely different circumstances. Someone notices something about it, slaps at some text with a comment on it. It takes on a new meaning, new context, and a new life of its own. So the context of where you see it and how it's being presented can really alter the meaning. We'll stop here. In the next video, we'll return to the Harry Callahan photos, and we'll apply this a little bit more. We'll come back and apply some different interpretive frameworks to those, just to see how they can help or hinder our understanding of those photographs.